Good day, everyone. This is Mark Vello, and you're listening to Headline News. U.S. and Canada added to Beijing sanctions list. Blinken, international scrutiny will be greater. Following the European Union and the United Kingdom, the United States and Canada have recently launched sanctions against the Chinese Communist Party for violating the human rights of Uyghur Muslims and ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. Beijing authorities then retaliated by taking counter-sanctions, including sanctions against two U.S. officials and a Canadian MP on the 26th. In addition to the previous sanctions against the European Union and the United Kingdom. In response, on March 27th, U.S. Secretary of State Antony John Blinken condemned Beijing's attempts to intimidate and silence those who speak out for human rights and fundamental freedoms, which in reality will only contribute to growing international scrutiny of the CCP's actions in Xinjiang. Blinken noted that the CCP sanctioned 28 U.S. officials in January, including former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former Health Secretary Alex Azar. Retaliation sanctions were also imposed last July on then U.S. State Department Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, Republican Senator Marco Rubio, and several Democratic human rights institutions. Blinken reiterated that the United States stands with Canada, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and other allies in urging Beijing to stop violating the human rights of Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang, and to release those who have been arbitrarily detained. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted on March 27 that the CCP's sanctions against two U.S. Religious Council officials and a Canadian lawmaker were unacceptable, and that he was committed to continuing to work with international partners to defend human rights around the world. The targets of the CCP's sanctions include Michael Chong, a Canadian MP, Vice Chair of Foreign Affairs and International Development, and Subcommittee Member on International Human Rights, as well as Gail Manchin, Chair, and Tony Perkins, Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Only last month, Canada's Parliament voted to pass a resolution finding that the CCP had committed genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Michael Chong was one of the sponsors of the motion. In a recent interview, Michael Chong expressed his hope that the Canadian government would recognize the resolution as soon as possible and work with its allies to strengthen economic sanctions against the CCP. Michael Chong pointed out that the CCP's human rights violations against vulnerable groups also include Falun Gong, Tibetans, and other ethnic minorities, as well as the rights to democracy and freedom in Hong Kong, and the international treaty Sino-British Joint Declaration, in addition to threats and illegal detentions of Canadian citizens, all of which are unacceptable to the international community. The European Union has announced sanctions against the CCP for human rights abuses against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, which is the first time in 30 years that the EU has sanctioned the CCP over human rights issues. The sanctions include a travel ban and asset freeze on 4 senior Xinjiang officials and one entity, the Public Security Bureau of the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp. The last time a serious measure such as this was enacted was on June 4, 1989, during the historic Tiananmen Square protests. Shinzo Abe. Japan has become the forefront of the U.S. China confrontation. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga will visit the United States in early April, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stated at a Liberal Democratic Party meeting on March 27th that Japan has become the front line of the U.S. China confrontation and urged Suga to formulate a policy toward China accordingly. According to Kyodo News, the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stated at a Liberal Democratic Party meeting on March 27th that Japan has become the front line of the U.S. China confrontation and urged Suga to formulate a policy toward China accordingly. Be mentally prepared that you have become the front line of the U.S. China conflict in the Indo Pacific region and develop a relevant Japanese foreign and security policy. The joint U.S. Japan strategy to confront the Chinese Communist Party was expressed in a joint statement issued by new Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin at a 2+2 summit with Japan's Foreign Minister and Defense Minister in Tokyo on March 16th. The two senior officials condemned the Communist Party's South China Sea claims and activities in the South China Sea as contrary to the international order. They called for ensuring stability in the Taiwan Strait and said they would counter the Communist Party in territorial disputes, its challenges to democracy, and other crises in the Indo-Pacific region. And in March this year, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia signaled this intention in a joint statement issued after the first summit of Quadrilateral and pledged their commitment to developing a partnership to address the historic crisis, although they did not mention the Chinese Communist Party. The statement read, "We strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion." The Indo-Pacific strategy is a vision put forward by Shinzo Abe in January 2013. He said then, "I envision a strategy whereby Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S. state of Hawaii form a diamond to safeguard the maritime commons stretching from the Indian Ocean region to the Western Pacific." He revisited this idea during his visit to the United States in February 2013, and in August 2016, Shinzo Abe formally proposed a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy at the African Development Conference. The strategy advocates that Japan, the United States, Australia, and India join forces to maintain economic prosperity and security in the Indo-Pacific region in order to strengthen their influence in the region and counter the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative, 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, and militarization of the South China Sea. Myanmar's massacres bloodiest day yet, 114 dead, faces international condemnation. The military government held a parade in the capital city of Nay Pyu Dur yesterday, Myanmar's Armed Forces Day, but its security forces continued their brutal crackdown on protesters at the same time, killing and injuring a record number of at least 114 people across the country, in what became the bloodiest day since the military coup seized power. The United States, Britain, France, the European Union, and the United Nations issued statements condemning the brutal slaughter of unarmed civilians. According to foreign media reports, the Burmese junta celebrated Armed Forces Day with great fanfare on Saturday the 27th, but warned on state television the night before that protesters would be in danger of getting shot to the head and back in an attempt to stop people from taking to the streets. At least 27 people were killed in Yangon, and a 1-year-old baby was shot in the eye with a rubber bullet, Reuters reported yesterday, citing local media. At least 40 people were killed in Mandalay, including a 13-year-old girl. A 5-year-old boy was injured. Another 13-year-old child was reported dead in the Sagaing region of central Myanmar. Myanmar's security forces continue to crack down on protesters and even kill them, drawing renewed criticism from the West. The British ambassador to Burma, Dan Chugh, said the Burmese security forces disgraced themselves by killing unarmed people. The French embassy in Burma issued a statement saying that a country's professional army is there to protect the people who serve them, not to harm them, and France called on the Burmese armed forces to stop the violence immediately. In a Facebook post, the U.S. Embassy in Burma condemned the military government for massacring civilians on Armed Forces Day. Security forces massacring unarmed people, including children, who they claim to protect, is not the behavior of a professional army or police. U.S. Ambassador to Burma, Thomas Vida, described yesterday's brutal crackdown as horrifying. In addition, U.S. Embassy spokesman Aryani Manring said the U.S. cultural region in Yangon, Burma's largest city, was also shot at that day. But fortunately, no one was injured, and the incident is being investigated. The European Union delegation to the United Nations issued a statement saying that the 76th Myanmar Armed Forces Day will forever be remembered as a day of terror and dishonor, and that the massacre of unarmed people, including children, was an unforgivable act. The EU stands with the people and calls for an immediate end to the atrocity and a return to democracy. The United Nations mission in Burma also issued a statement saying that such violence is totally unacceptable and must stop immediately. As Christine Schraner Bergener, UN Special Envoy for Burma, said, "It is the responsibility of the military to ensure peace and defend the people, but the Burmese military government is turning against its own people." Myanmar Now, an English-language news portal, said protesters gathered in Yangon, Mandalay, and other towns to protest on Military Day, and the military continued to crack down on the protesters, killing 114 people across the country. Dr. Sasa, spokesman for the Committee of Representatives of the Union Parliament of Burma, committee representing Pyadungsu Hluto, CRP8, but is made up of deposed MPs, said yesterday was Armed Forces Day, but also a day of military shame during an online forum yesterday. According to reports, with the number of people killed today, the total number of people killed since the February 1st coup has now exceeded 440. This concludes today's broadcast. Thank you for your time, and stay tuned for the next headline news.